Hey guys, this episode was taken from an episode of the Michael Harper Spanish podcast. If you want to listen to that podcast, be able to listen to it on the go on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc., click on the link in the description if you want to do that. But this is the exact same episode, just with a video with my camera on, basically. Be sure that you also click on the other link in the description if you want a link to my free training on how to become fluent in Spanish within a year. I teach you all of the things you need to know, my methodology that'll allow you to accelerate your Spanish learning and become fluent within a year. So let's get into this podcast episode. So I believe I've made some videos and podcasts before about should you travel to a Spanish-speaking country to practice and get better at your Spanish, but this episode is going to be more about when should you travel to a Spanish-speaking country. So I'm really excited about this episode. Let's get into it. Now I'm going to make another episode as well about where to go, so that'll be a different episode, probably the next one, but I want to talk about something that's probably more important than if you should go or where you should go. It's when should you go, because a lot of people think that, if I'm thinking about learning Spanish, the ideal thing would be to just move to a Spanish-speaking country, and that's probably not the best thing you could do. I actually think that you should have a good understanding of Spanish, a base, before you go. So there's definitely a time to travel when you will get the most out of it. I'm not saying it's a bad thing if you have the means and you're able to travel to a Spanish-speaking country and learn that way. That's great. But I will say, I've personally done a study abroad program in Spain where I lived there for a few months. I was already fluent. Me personally, I was already fluent before I got there. So I feel like it was just, a fun way to just explore the country and just explore Europe, right? But I met some people there who were learning Spanish, who really didn't know a lot of Spanish, and they definitely struggled. And a lot of times they relied on English instead of Spanish. So I think that you need to know, in order to get the most out of it, you need to know a good amount of Spanish. And there's a lot of different ways to immerse yourself and to learn Spanish before you go. That way you can speak it. But I think you should have a fairly good conversational level of Spanish before you even consider going. If you win, again, this is if you want to get the most out of it, You're still going to get something out of it if you decide to go before, if you decide to, just start from zero in a Spanish-speaking country and do a study abroad program. But I will say, go to that country already feeling really confident in Spanish. I have a lot of students of mine that I know, that I've talked to, that have gone to Spanish-speaking countries, and they've struggled. And then what happens? You go there, you might think that your Spanish is decent enough to get by, but then you go to order like a coffee, and they talk to you, and you don't know what they're saying. They're speaking too fast, or your vocabulary wasn't good enough. Whatever the reason is that you couldn't really understand or communicate that well, you're going to come back, you're going to feel unmotivated, and then you might even stop learning Spanish, or you're going to take a long break. It takes a big toll on you and your confidence if you go there before you're ready to really get the most out of it. So think about that. Like, imagine you're excited to go to a Spanish-speaking country, you're excited to practice your Spanish, and then you get there, and then you can't even use it. You rely on English. You can't understand anybody. I mean, think about what that does to your confidence. But if you have already some experience of talking to native speakers online before you go, specifically, if you can talk to native speakers that are from the place that you plan on going in the future, and you're able to sustain a conversation with them, you're able to understand them, get used to their accent, the words that they use, etc., and then you go there, and then you're able to order your food, you're able to talk to some locals there, you're able to understand people when they talk to you, you're able to pick up some words of other locals there that are just talking to each other, whether it's at coffee shops or at the grocery store or wherever. Think about how much better of an experience that would be versus you going too soon when you're just not ready for that. So again, if you want to go and live there for a certain amount of time, then that's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's so many ways to immerse yourself and get your Spanish really good before you even go. Again, I always recommend italki for tutors, and you can specifically search for tutors that are from that country where you plan on going. You can do it for free using HelloTalk or Tandem as well. Those are language exchange apps. And again, you can filter those apps to look for people that are from the country that you want to go. so you can get used to the way they talk. You can already have had conversations with these people from these countries that you're visiting before you even visit and step foot in that country. It's an amazing way. So that's the main purpose of this episode, is get you out of that mentality of, I'm just going to go because I want to get better at Spanish. It's like, are you really going to get better at Spanish if you went too soon? So think about it that way. And you really don't ever have to go, especially with how many native speakers are in the U.S. now. I mean, if your sole purpose of traveling to a Spanish-speaking country is to practice and learn and get better at Spanish, I mean, you don't have to do that at all. There's so many ways to practice in the U.S. in your bedroom. I already mentioned some apps already, and I have tons of episodes and other resources you can use. But I mean, you can find easily coworkers and friends of coworkers and friends of friends and even family members perhaps that already speak Spanish. You can go to different events in the U.S. I mean, you go to some parts of the U.S., some cities and neighborhoods, and you're like, this feels like Latin America. I know that because I'm in Latin America right now. So you don't even have to step foot outside of the U.S. with as many native Spanish speakers that there are. I believe within a decade or two, it's going to be like a third of people in the U.S. or a fourth of people in the U.S. are going to speak Spanish as a first or second language. So you don't even have to step foot outside of the U.S. in a lot of cases if your sole purpose is to practice your Spanish. But I highly recommend that you learn Spanish good enough to where you can travel to these Spanish-speaking countries, because it's such a cool cultural experience. It's such a cool experience just to have everybody around you speaking Spanish, and not just that they're speaking Spanish. It's just cool to step foot there and see all of the signs in Spanish, the stop signs in Spanish, the bathroom signs, the airport advertisements, everything just in that language. Is a really cool immersive experience. It's cool hearing it all around you. To me, that's why I like to travel to different countries. I like to hear the language around me, the differences, how they live. I like to do what locals do. I don't necessarily do all the touristy stuff right off the bat. I like to just go to the restaurants where locals go to, and I like to go to the smaller towns, especially in those countries. That's another big tip when you go to these Spanish-speaking countries. Depending on the country, like let's say you go to Spain. If you just go to like Madrid or Barcelona or those big cities, chances are it's a lot easier to rely on English because a lot of people there speak English. If you go to the smaller towns, not a lot of people at all speak English, I've noticed. So those are great places to go. If you go to places like Colombia, not a lot of people here speak English either. Even in bigger cities like Medellin and Bogota, those cities, it's just not as common for that many people to be fluent. But if you go to bigger European cities, I've noticed it's a lot more common for the people that work there to speak English with you. So something to keep in mind. If you want a truly immersive experience, maybe go to those smaller towns, or just have a good level of Spanish. Good enough level to where they don't switch to English to try to help you, because that can be frustrating too. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Again, check out that free training on how to become fluent in Spanish within a year if you haven't already. I'll put the link to that in the description, or you can go to michaelharperspanish.com and click on Let's Get Started to get started. Hope you enjoyed this episode. See you in the next one. Ciao.